The key felt heavier in my hand than it should have, considering it was just a piece of brass cut into the shape that would unlock my grandfather's legacy. 3 months had passed since Abuelo Rafael's funeral, and I was finally ready to deal with his property in Las Cruces, New Mexico. The drive from Phoenix had taken me through desert landscapes that reminded me of every summer I'd spent visiting him as a kid. My grandfather had been the cornerstone of our family, a man who'd immigrated from Mexico in the 1960s and built a life through sheer determination and unwavering faith. He'd worked construction during the week and served as a lay minister at the small Catholic church he'd helped establish on the outskirts of town. Everyone knew Rafael Martinez as a man of God, a devoted husband to my grandmother until her death 10 years ago, and a loving grandfather to me and my 3 cousins. Now at 32, I was the executor of his estate, mainly because I was the only one in the family who lived within driving distance and didn't have young children to worry about. My cousins in California and Texas had been happy to let me handle the details, especially since the inheritance wasn't particularly valuable, just a modest adobe house, some old furniture, and the small storage building behind the church where Abuelo had kept maintenance supplies and equipment. The house had been easy to deal with. I'd spent the previous weekend boxing up his personal belongings, donating clothes to charity, and preparing the property for sale. Most of his possessions told the story I expected: photo albums full of family gatherings, religious books in Spanish, tools worn smooth by decades of honest work. But I'd saved the storage building for last, partly out of procrastination and partly because of something the parish priest, Father Miguel, had mentioned at the funeral. "Your grandfather was very particular about that storage room," he'd said. "In 40 years, I never saw him let anyone else go in there, not even to help him carry things. Always said he preferred to handle the church maintenance himself." At the time, I'd assumed it was just Abuelo's way. He'd always been meticulous about his responsibilities, whether at home or at church. But standing in front of the weathered wooden door with R. Martinez, Church Maintenance, painted in fading letters, I found myself wondering what he'd been so protective of. The building sat about 50 yards behind Iglesia de San Antonio, nestled between 2 large cottonwood trees that provided shade during the brutal New Mexico summers. It was larger than I'd remembered from childhood, maybe 15 feet by 20 feet, with thick adobe walls and a corrugated metal roof that had weathered decades of desert storms. I slid the key into the padlock and turned it. The lock opened with a satisfying click that seemed to echo in the quiet afternoon air. The door swung open on hinges that creaked like they hadn't been used in months. The smell hit me first, not unpleasant, but distinct. Old paper, dust, and something else I couldn't identify. As my eyes adjusted to the dim interior, I reached for the light switch and flicked on the single bare bulb that hung from the ceiling. What I saw wasn't what I'd expected. Yes, there were maintenance supplies, paint cans, brushes, a lawnmower, boxes of light bulbs and cleaning supplies. But there was also furniture that clearly didn't belong in a storage shed: a comfortable reading chair with a small table beside it, a mini refrigerator humming quietly in the corner, bookshelves lined with paperback novels and magazines. It looked less like storage and more like a private retreat. "What were you doing out here, Abuelo?" I murmured to myself. I walked deeper into the room, noting details that made the space feel personal rather than practical. A coffee maker sat on a small counter, with a canister of grounds that still smelled fresh. Family photos were tacked to one wall, but as I looked closer, I realized I didn't recognize some of the people in them. There were pictures of my grandfather, but he was with people I'd never seen before. A woman with kind eyes and graying hair, 2 children, a boy and a girl at various ages from elementary school through what looked like high school graduation. In some photos, my grandfather had his arm around the woman in a way that looked intimate. My hands started shaking as I took down one of the photographs. It showed my grandfather at what appeared to be a birthday party, smiling broadly as he helped a young boy blow out candles on a cake. The boy looked to be about 8 years old, with dark hair and features that reminded me of my own childhood photos, but I had no idea who he was. I spent the next hour searching through the space more systematically. In addition to the mysterious photos, I found a calendar on the wall with appointments marked in my grandfather's handwriting. Maria, doctor appointment. David's baseball game. Elena's recital. Maria, David, Elena. Names that meant nothing to me, but apparently meant everything to my grandfather. The most shocking discovery came when I moved the reading chair to get a better look at something behind it. Underneath were 3 large cardboard file boxes, each labeled with years spanning from 1990 to 2024. The first box I opened was filled with letters, hundreds of them, organized chronologically and rubber-banded together by year. I picked up a bundle from 1995 and carefully removed the rubber band. The letters were handwritten on simple stationery, all addressed to Mi querido Rafael, my dear Rafael. The return address showed they'd been sent from Albuquerque, about 4 hours north. With trembling hands, I opened the first letter and began to read. Mi amor, David asked about you again today. He doesn't understand why you can't come to his soccer games like the other fathers. I told him you have important work to do, but it gets harder every time. He's such a bright boy and he loves you so much during your visits. Elena is doing well in school. She got an A on her math test and wanted me to tell you right away. The letter was signed, Con todo mi amor, Maria, with all my love, Maria. I read it 3 times before the words fully sank in. My grandfather, the man I'd idolized, the devoted widower who'd raised me to believe in the sanctity of marriage and family, had been living a double life. Somewhere in Albuquerque there was a woman named Maria and her children, David and Eleanor, who thought of my grandfather as, what? A father? A husband? I grabbed another bundle of letters, these from 2010, and found more of the same. Updates about the children's lives, expressions of love and longing, references to visits and time spent together. In one letter, Maria mentioned how difficult it was to explain to the children why Rafael couldn't be there for Christmas, why he could only visit certain weekends. The children don't understand, she wrote. They love you like a father, but you can only give us pieces of your life. I know you have responsibilities in Las Cruces, but sometimes I wonder if we'll always have to live in the shadows. I sat heavily in the reading chair, my grandfather's secret correspondence scattered around me. The man who'd taught me about honor and integrity, who'd preached about the importance of family and fidelity, had been maintaining a secret relationship for decades. Based on the dates in the letters, this had been going on since before my grandmother's death. The afternoon sun was starting to slant through the small window, casting long shadows across the room. I looked up at the photos on the wall with new understanding. This wasn't just a storage room. It was my grandfather's secret life, the place where he could be with the family he couldn't publicly acknowledge. But why? Why had he lived this way? And what was I supposed to do with this information now that he was gone? I thought about Maria and her children in Albuquerque. Did they know my grandfather had died? Had they been at the funeral, watching from a distance while our family mourned publicly? Or were they still waiting for him to visit, wondering why he hadn't called or written? The letters in my hands represented more than 30 years of secret love, hidden relationships, and parallel lives. They were evidence of a betrayal that would shatter everything I thought I knew about the man who'd helped raise me. But they were also evidence of love, complicated, impossible love, that had somehow sustained itself in shadows and stolen moments for 3 decades. As the sun set over the New Mexico desert, I sat in my grandfather's secret sanctuary, surrounded by the letters that would change everything. I had to decide whether to protect his memory or seek the truth about the family I'd never known existed. Either choice would mean confronting the reality that the hero of my childhood was a man I'd never really known at all. I couldn't sleep that night in my grandfather's house. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Maria's handwritten words, David's unknown face in those photographs, Eleanor's graduation picture on the wall of a storage room I'd never known existed. The letters were stacked on the kitchen table, where I'd been reading them since sunset, organized into neat piles by decade, like evidence in a case I was trying to solve. The coffee maker gurgled to life as dawn broke over the Organ Mountains, and I settled in for what I knew would be a long day of revelations. I decided to read through everything chronologically, to understand how this secret life had begun and evolved over 3 decades. The earliest letters, from 1990, painted a picture I was struggling to accept. Maria Gonzalez had been working as a secretary at the construction company where my grandfather was a foreman. She was 28, divorced with a 4-year-old daughter named Elena. The first few letters were formal, professional, updates about work schedules, mentions of shared coffee breaks. But by 1991, the tone had shifted dramatically. Rafael, I can't stop thinking about what you said yesterday. You're right that this is complicated. You have a wife, a family, responsibilities I understand and respect. But what I feel for you isn't going away, and I don't think what you feel for me is either. Maybe we shouldn't see each other outside of work anymore. Maybe that would be better for everyone. I found my grandfather's reply in a separate folder marked Copies Personal. His handwriting was more cramped than Maria's, but his words were painfully honest. Maria, I've been married for 25 years, and I've never betrayed Carmen's trust. I never thought I would, but you've awakened something in me that I thought was dead. I know this is wrong. I know it goes against everything I've preached and believed, but I can't bear the thought of not seeing you again. What followed was a correspondence that documented the beginning of an affair that would reshape both their lives. By 1992, Maria had moved to Albuquerque with Elena, ostensibly for a better job opportunity. But the letters revealed the truth. My grandfather had helped arrange the move, set her up in an apartment and begun visiting her every other weekend. The arrangement had continued even after my grandmother's death in 2014. In fact, some of the letters from that period showed Maria encouraging my grandfather to make their relationship public now that he was free to do so. Raphael, I know you're grieving Carmen, and I would never ask you to dishonor her memory. But the children are getting older. They're asking harder questions about why you can't be here all the time. David is 15 now. He needs a father figure consistently, not just on weekends. We've been living in the shadows for over 20 years. When will it be our turn to live in the light? My grandfather's response broke my heart. Mi amor, you know I would marry you tomorrow if I could, but my family in Las Cruces, they knew Carmen for 30 years. They think of me as the devoted husband who never recovered from losing her. If they knew about you, about David and Elena, it would destroy everything they believe about me. I can't bear to disappoint them that way. This arrangement isn't perfect, but it protects everyone. So I had to stop reading and walk outside into the morning air. My grandfather hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been living a complete double life, maintaining two families in two different cities, being two different versions of himself. In Las Cruces, he was the grieving widower, the devoted grandfather, the pillar of the church community. In Albuquerque, he was Maria's partner, David and Elena's father figure, a man living a secret love story. When I returned to the letters, I found more details about the children who'd never met their Las Cruces family. David had been born in 1993, and from the earliest letters mentioning him, it was clear my grandfather considered him a son. Elena, who'd been 4 when the relationship began, had grown up calling him Papa Raphael. There were report cards with my grandfather's proud comments written in the margins. Birthday cards he'd sent from Las Cruces, with carefully neutral messages that wouldn't reveal the true nature of their relationship if intercepted. Photos of Little League games and school plays that he'd attended whenever possible. The most devastating discovery came in a letter from 2018, when David was 25 and Elena was 32. Raphael, David called yesterday with news that will make you so proud. He and Sarah are engaged. He wants you to walk him down the aisle. I told him I'd discuss it with you, but we both know the answer. You can't be at your own son's wedding because no one can know he's your son. My heart breaks for both of you, my son. The words jumped off the page like they were written in fire. David wasn't just someone my grandfather had helped raise. He was my grandfather's biological child, which meant Elena was my aunt, and David was my uncle. And somewhere in Albuquerque was a family that shared my blood, but had never been allowed to know I existed. I found photos of David's wedding in a manila envelope marked 2019. My grandfather had been there, but in the pictures he looked like a family friend rather than the father of the groom. Maria stood beside him in the photos, and I could see the sadness in her eyes even as she smiled for the camera. There were pictures of grandchildren too. David had 2 young children, a boy and a girl, who called my grandfather Abuelo Rafael, just like I had. But they knew him as their grandmother's special friend, not as their actual grandfather. The final letters from 2024 were the hardest to read. My grandfather's health had been declining, and Maria was clearly frustrated with their continued secrecy. Raphael, the doctors say your heart condition is getting worse. What happens to us if something happens to you? David and Elena don't even know your real last name, don't know where you live, don't know about your other family. We've spent 34 years loving you in secret. Don't we deserve more than that before it's too late? My grandfather's last letter to Maria was dated just 2 weeks before his heart attack. Maria, I know I've been selfish all these years. I wanted both families, wanted to be everything to everyone, and instead I've been only half a man to all of you. If something happens to me, there are papers in the storage room behind the church. My grandson David in Las Cruces is handling my affairs. He's a good man like his father was. Maybe someday when the time is right, the 2 sides of my life can know each other. Maybe then you and the children can understand why I lived the way I did. I sat back in the kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what I'd discovered. My grandfather hadn't just been keeping a secret, he'd been protecting multiple families from the pain of his choices. He'd known that revealing his double life would devastate everyone involved, so he'd carried the burden alone for 34 years. But now he was gone, and the burden had passed to me. Somewhere in Albuquerque, Maria was probably wondering why Raphael had stopped writing. David and Elena were waiting for visits that would never come. Two small children would grow up wondering what happened to their abuelo Raphael. And in Las Cruces, my cousins and I were preparing to sell our grandfather's house and close the book on his life, never knowing that half his story was still being written 4 hours north. I looked at the pile of letters, at the photographs of faces that shared my features, at the evidence of a love story that had lasted 3 decades in the shadows. I thought about my grandfather's final words about the two sides of his life someday knowing each other. Maybe he'd been hoping I would be the bridge between his two families. Maybe he'd been counting on me to finish what he'd been too afraid to start. But bridging two families meant revealing secrets that would shatter everything both sides believed about the man they'd loved. It meant admitting that our hero had been deeply, fundamentally flawed. It meant opening wounds that had been carefully hidden for over 30 years. As the morning sun climbed higher over the New Mexico desert, I made a decision that would change the lives of people I'd never met, but who shared my blood. I was going to drive to Albuquerque and find Maria Gonzalez. I was going to tell her that Rafael Martinez had died, and I was going to decide whether his two families deserved to know the truth about each other. The letters had given me a roadmap to my grandfather's secret life. Now I had to decide whether to follow it all the way to the end. The 2-hour drive from Las Cruces to Albuquerque gave me plenty of time to rehearse what I was going to say to Maria Gonzalez, but every scenario I imagined ended badly. How do you tell a woman that the man she loved for 34 years is dead, and that you're the grandson he never told her about? How do you explain that you've been reading through decades of her most private thoughts, her most intimate feelings, her frustrations and disappointments with a man who couldn't give her what she deserved? I'd found Maria's current address in my grandfather's address book, written in the careful handwriting I remembered from birthday cards he'd sent me over the years. She lived in a modest neighborhood in northeast Albuquerque, according to the GPS directions I'd programmed into my phone. The letters had painted a picture of Maria that made me both nervous and curious to meet her. She was clearly a strong woman, raising 2 children largely on her own, while maintaining a relationship that existed only on weekends and in stolen moments. She'd worked her way up from secretary to office manager at an accounting firm, had put both her children through college, and had somehow managed to love a man who could never fully belong to her. The most recent letters suggested she was 62 now, retired and living alone since David and Eleanor had started their own families. The letters also suggested she'd been getting increasingly frustrated with the secrecy of their relationship, especially as my grandfather's health declined. I pulled into Maria's neighborhood just after lunch, driving slowly down tree-lined streets that looked like they'd been developed in the 1970s. The houses were small but well-maintained, with neat lawns and flower gardens that spoke of pride in ownership despite modest circumstances. Maria's house was a pale yellow adobe with a red tile roof and a small front porch decorated with hanging plants. My grandfather's pickup truck wasn't in the driveway, of course. He'd been buried 3 months ago, but I found myself looking for it anyway. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, engine running, trying to find the courage to walk up to that front door. What if Maria became angry when she learned I'd been reading her private letters? What if she blamed me for my grandfather's secrecy? What if she didn't want to meet the family he'd hidden from her for so long? Finally, I turned off the engine and forced myself to walk up the concrete path to her front door. Before I could lose my nerve, I knocked. The woman who answered the door was exactly what I'd expected and nothing like what I'd imagined. Maria Gonzalez was petite, probably 5'2", with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. She had the kind of face that showed her age, but also showed that she'd lived those years with grace and dignity. Her eyes were the same warm brown I'd seen in the photographs from my grandfather's storage room. "Can I help you?" she asked, and I heard a slight accent that reminded me of my grandfather's voice. "Mrs. Gonzalez? My name is David Martinez. I paused, realizing I didn't know how to introduce myself. "I'm Raphael's grandson." Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, shock, and finally, something that might have been fear. "Raphael's grandson?" she repeated slowly. From Las Cruces. Yes, ma'am, I need to talk to you about my grandfather. May I come in? Maria looked past me toward the street, as if checking to see who might be watching, then stepped aside to let me enter. Her living room was comfortable and homey, with family photos on every surface and the smell of coffee lingering in the air. I immediately recognized some of the faces in the photographs from the pictures in my grandfather's storage room. Sit down, Maria said, gesturing to a couch covered with a hand-crocheted Afghan. Can I get you something to drink? Coffee. Coffee would be great. Thank you. She disappeared into the kitchen, and I used the time to study the room more carefully. There were photos of David and Elena at various ages, graduation pictures, wedding photos, pictures of grandchildren, but there were also photos of my grandfather scattered throughout, at birthday parties, family gatherings, casual moments that captured the life they'd shared in Albuquerque. In this house, he wasn't the secret. We were. Maria returned with 2 cups of coffee and settled into a chair across from me. She looked nervous but determined, like someone preparing to hear news she'd been dreading. Raphael hasn't been returning my calls, she said without preamble. I haven't heard from him in 3 months. I've been worried about his heart condition, but I didn't know how to check on him without calling Las Cruces. He always said that would cause problems. My chest tightened. She'd been worrying about him for 3 months, not knowing he was dead, not knowing she'd never see him again. Mrs. Gonzalez, I said gently, my grandfather died 3 months ago. He had a heart attack at home. I'm sorry. I thought you might have heard somehow. The coffee cup slipped from her hands, hitting the carpeted floor with a dull thud. Coffee spread in a dark stain, but Maria didn't seem to notice. She just stared at me with eyes that were suddenly filled with 34 years of grief. Dead? She whispered. Raphael is dead. Yes, ma'am. March 15th. It was quick. He didn't suffer. Maria covered her face with her hands and began to cry. Not the polite tears of someone trying to maintain composure, but the raw, devastating sobs of someone who'd just lost the love of her life and was mourning in private, just as she'd loved in private. I didn't know what to do. This woman was a stranger to me, but she'd been the most important person in my grandfather's secret world. I got up and found some paper towels in the kitchen to clean up the coffee spill, giving her time to process the news. When I returned, Maria had composed herself slightly, though her eyes were red and her hands were shaking. How did you find me? She asked. Raphael always said his Las Cruces family didn't know about us. This was the moment I'd been dreading. I found your letters in his storage room behind the church, hundreds of them, going back to 1990. I've been reading them, trying to understand who my grandfather really was. Maria's expression shifted from grief to something approaching panic. You read my letters? All of them? Most of them? I'm sorry. I know they were private, but I didn't understand what I was finding at first, and then I couldn't stop reading. I had to know the truth. And now you know, Maria said quietly. Now you know your grandfather wasn't the saint you thought he was. I know he was more complicated than I realized, I said carefully. I know he loved you. I know he loved David and Elena. I know he spent 34 years trying to be 2 people at once. Maria looked at me for a long moment, studying my face. You look like him, she said finally. You have his eyes. David has those same eyes. David is my grandfather's son, I said. It wasn't a question. The letters had made that clear. Yes. Raphael was the only father David ever knew, even if he couldn't acknowledge it publicly. Elena, too. She was only 4 when we started, when Raphael became part of our lives. He raised them, loved them, provided for them, but they think he was just my partner, not their father. Do they know he's dead? Maria shook her head. I didn't know how to tell them without explaining why I knew, and they didn't. They've been asking why Raphael hasn't visited lately, but I kept making excuses. I thought maybe he was pulling away because of his health, or because he'd finally decided to choose his Las Cruces family over us. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us processing the impossible complexity of the situation. My grandfather had died 3 months ago, and half his family had been grieving in secret while the other half had been worrying in secret. Mrs. Gonzalez, I said finally, David and Elena deserve to know their father is dead, and they deserve to know the truth about who he was. The truth? Maria laughed bitterly. The truth is that their father was a man who loved 2 families but couldn't choose between them. The truth is that they've lived their entire lives as a secret, and now that he's gone, they'll never get the chance to be anything else. Maybe that doesn't have to be true, I said. Maybe it's time for his two families to meet each other. Maria stared at me like I'd suggested something impossible. Meet each other? Do you understand what that would mean? It would mean admitting that Raphael lived a lie for 34 years. It would mean telling David and Elena that everything they thought they knew about their father was incomplete. It would mean telling your Las Cruces family that their hero had a secret family he never told them about. Maybe, I said, but it would also mean that David's children could know their cousins. It would mean Elena could meet the aunt she never knew she had. It would mean you wouldn't have to grieve alone anymore. Maria was quiet for a long time, staring at the coffee stain on her carpet. Finally, she looked up at me with eyes that held 3 decades of carefully guarded hope. Your grandfather wrote in his last letter that maybe someday his two families could know each other. I thought he was just trying to make me feel better about the situation. You really think it's possible? I don't know, I admitted, but I think my grandfather spent 34 years protecting everyone from the pain of the truth. Maybe it's time to find out if the truth is really more painful than the secrets. Maria nodded slowly. David and Elena are coming for dinner tomorrow night. They always come on Sundays. It was one of the times Raphael couldn't be here, so we made it our family time. Would you like to meet them? My heart started pounding. Meeting my grandfather's secret children meant crossing a line I couldn't uncross. It meant committing to a truth that would change everything for both families, but it also meant honoring my grandfather's final wish that his two sides might someday know each other. Yes, I said, I'd like to meet them very much. I spent Saturday night in a hotel room in Albuquerque, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life. Maria and I had agreed that I would come to dinner the next evening, and she would introduce me as Raphael's grandson from Las Cruces. We'd decided to start with that simple truth and see how David and Elena responded before revealing the deeper complications. But lying in that generic hotel bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the ripple effects of what I was about to do. My cousins in California and Texas had no idea I was in Albuquerque. They thought I was still in Las Cruces, finishing up the details of our grandfather's estate. When they learned about David and Elena, they'd realize that our inheritance should have been shared with additional family members. They'd understand that our grandfather's modest savings had been supporting 2 households, not one, and David and Elena would learn that the man they'd called Papa Raphael had another family he'd considered his real one, even if that wasn't true. I arrived at Maria's house at 6 o'clock Sunday evening, carrying a bottle of wine and a stomach full of butterflies. Through the front window, I could see additional cars in the driveway and hear the sounds of family conversation and laughter from inside. Maria answered the door wearing a blue dress that made her look younger than her 62 years. Her eyes were still red from crying the day before, but she'd applied makeup carefully and managed a warm smile. "David, I'm so glad you came," she said, and I could hear the nervous energy in her voice. "Everyone's in the kitchen." I followed her through the living room I'd seen the day before, noting that she'd removed the most obvious photos of my grandfather from the surfaces where David and Eleanor might see them, and start asking questions we weren't ready to answer. The kitchen was warm and filled with the smells of Sunday dinner: roast beef, homemade tortillas, and something that smelled like my grandmother's famous flan. 2 people were sitting at the breakfast counter, a man and a woman who looked up when Maria and I entered. "David, Elena," Maria said, "I'd like you to meet David Martinez. He's Raphael's grandson from Las Cruces." The silence that followed was loaded with surprise and confusion. I found myself looking into faces that were unmistakably related to me. David had my grandfather's strong jaw and dark eyes, while Elena had the same delicate features as my cousin Patricia. But more than physical resemblance, I could see my grandfather's expressions in their faces, his mannerisms in the way they tilted their heads when curious. David stood up first, extending his hand with a cautious smile. He was about my age, maybe a year or 2 younger, with the build of someone who worked with his hands. "David Martinez too, huh? That's going to be confusing." "You can call me Dave," I said, shaking his hand and feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work. "Nice to meet you." Eleanor was more reserved, studying me with intelligent eyes that reminded me of my Aunt Carmen. She was elegant in the way that some women achieve in their 40s, with dark hair streaked with premature silver and laugh lines that suggested she smiled often. "Raphael never mentioned having a grandson named David," she said carefully. "He mentioned you both," I replied, which was true, though not in the way she probably thought. "He talked about how proud he was of your accomplishments." Maria busied herself with dinner preparations, clearly nervous about the conversation. "David drove up from Las Cruces to meet you," she said. I thought it would be nice for you to know some of Raphael's other family. Other family, Eleanor repeated, and I heard a note of curiosity in her voice. How many of you are there in Las Cruces? Just my 3 cousins and me now, I said. Our parents died when I was young, so my grandfather helped raise me. He was very important to all of us. David's expression softened. He was important to us too. More like a father than... He trailed off, glancing at Maria with an expression I couldn't quite read. More like a father than what? I asked. Elena and David exchanged a look that spoke of years of shared questions and incomplete answers. It's complicated, Elena said finally. Raphael was Mum's partner, I guess, but he never lived here full time. He had his work in Las Cruces, his responsibilities there. We saw him on weekends mostly, special occasions. It was an unusual arrangement. We always wondered why he couldn't just move to Albuquerque permanently, David added, especially after his wife died, but he said he had obligations he couldn't leave behind. I looked at Maria, who was focused very intently on stirring something on the stove. The obligations he couldn't leave behind were us, his Las Cruces family, who had no idea about the family in Albuquerque. What kind of work did you think he did? I asked. Construction management, David replied. That's what he told us. Said he had contracts with several companies down south that required his personal attention. It wasn't technically a lie. My grandfather had worked construction before retiring, but it also wasn't the whole truth. Nothing about my grandfather's life had been the whole truth. David, Elena said, using my name experimentally. What was Raphael like in Las Cruces? Was he different there? The question was more perceptive than she probably realized. What do you mean? Here, he was always a little sad, you know, like he was missing something important. He'd get this distant look sometimes, especially around holidays. Mom always said he was thinking about his wife, but it seemed like more than grief, David finished. Like he was torn between 2 worlds or something. Because he was, I thought. He was literally living 2 different lives, being 2 different people, and it was tearing him apart. He talked about you both a lot, I said, which was true based on the letters I'd read. He was very proud of your achievements. David, he mentioned you play baseball? David's face lit up. Played. High school and a little in college. Raphael came to as many games as he could, but his schedule was always complicated. How did you know about that? I'd learned about it from letters where Maria had written about games my grandfather missed because he was in Las Cruces with us, attending my own graduation ceremonies and family events. He kept track of everyone's activities, I said carefully. He had a good memory for details about people he cared about. Maria called us to dinner then, which gave me a reprieve from the increasingly complex conversation. The dining room table was set for 4 with her good china, and the meal was elaborate enough to suggest this was an important occasion for her. As we ate, David and Eleanor shared stories about their lives. David worked as an electrician and had 2 young children, while Elena was a high school teacher married to another teacher. They spoke about my grandfather with obvious affection, but also with the kind of questions that come from loving someone whose life remains partially mysterious. Did Raphael ever talk about wanting more children? Elena asked me during dessert. I always thought he'd make a great father, but he never had kids with his wife, right? The irony was almost too much to bear. Raphael had been a great father, to David, to Elena, and in his way to me and my cousins. But he'd never been able to be a complete father to anyone because of the impossible balancing act he'd maintained. I think he wanted children very much, I said honestly. But sometimes circumstances make things complicated. David nodded thoughtfully. That's what I figured. He always seemed so natural with kids, with us when we were younger, now with my children, but he never talked about his regrets or what he wished had been different. After dinner, Elena showed me photo albums, while David helped Maria clean up. The pictures told the story of a family life that had unfolded in the spaces between my grandfather's visits to Las Cruces. Birthday parties, graduations, holidays, all the milestones of a normal family, except one parent was only there part-time. This is from my wedding, Elena said, showing me a picture I'd seen before in my grandfather's storage room. Raphael walked me down the aisle. My biological father had never been part of my life, so Raphael was the natural choice, but it felt strange having him give me away when he wasn't officially my stepfather. He wasn't officially anything, David added, rejoining us with coffee cups. That was always the weird part. We loved him, he loved us, but there was never any legal relationship, no adoption papers, no marriage certificate with Mom. It was all just understanding. I looked at Maria, who was listening to her children talk about the man they'd never fully been able to claim as their father. The pain in her eyes was evident. 34 years of watching the people she loved most exist in legal and social limbo. Maybe, I said carefully, the relationships that matter most don't always need official papers. Maybe, Elena agreed. But it would have been nice to have that security, that acknowledgement, especially now that he's getting older and his health isn't great. What happens to us if something happens to Raphael? The question hung in the air like a challenge. David and Elena had no idea that something had already happened to Raphael, that he'd been dead for 3 months, while they wondered why he'd stopped visiting. They had no legal claim to anything he'd left behind, no official standing as his family, no way to even be notified if he died. I think, I said slowly, that Raphael loved you both more than you probably realize, and I think he wanted to make sure you were taken care of, no matter what happened. Maria was looking at me with an expression that mixed hope and terror. She knew I was building toward a revelation that would change everything, but she also knew there was no going back once the truth was spoken. David, she said quietly, there's something we need to tell you both about Raphael. The tone of her voice made both David and Elena look up sharply. They could sense that whatever was coming would be significant. He's not just getting older, Maria continued. He died 3 months ago. That's why David came to see us. That's why he's here. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched David and Eleanor process the news, saw the exact moment when the reality hit them. Their father figure, the man who'd been the most stable presence in their lives for 30 years, was gone. Eleanor started crying first, quiet tears that spoke of a grief she'd have to carry privately, just as she'd carried her love privately. David just sat there staring at the coffee table, his jaw working like he was trying to find words that didn't exist. 3 months, David finally said. He's been dead for 3 months and we're just finding out now. The anger in his voice was directed at the situation, not at me, but it still hurt to hear. They had every right to be angry. They'd been denied even the chance to say goodbye to the man who'd raised them. Why didn't anyone tell us? Elena asked through her tears. Why weren't we at the funeral? Why weren't we notified? This was the moment of truth, the point where I had to decide whether to reveal the full complexity of my grandfather's double life or find some way to soften the blow. I looked at Maria, who nodded slightly, giving me permission to tell the story she'd been keeping secret for 34 years. Because, I said, my family in Las Cruces didn't know you existed, just like you didn't know we existed. Raphael kept us separate from each other for 34 years. The confession hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything we thought we knew about the man we'd all loved. The silence in Maria's dining room stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. David and Elena sat frozen, processing what I'd just told them. Maria had covered her face with her hands, finally released from carrying the weight of the secret alone, but now facing the consequences of its revelation. Elena was the first to speak. What do you mean, he kept us separate? Are you saying Raphael had 2 families? Yes, I said simply. In Las Cruces, he was my grandfather, the man who helped raise me and my cousins after our parents died. He was the devoted widower who never got over losing our grandmother, Carmen. Here he was your father figure, Maria's partner, part of your family. He lived 2 completely different lives. David stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his back to us. That's impossible. You can't maintain 2 families for 30 years without someone finding out. People would know. He did it by compartmentalizing everything, I said. He told you he had work obligations in Las Cruces that required him to be there during the week. He told us he needed time alone on weekends to process his grief over losing our grandmother. He created stories that explained his absences to both families. Eleanor wiped her eyes with her napkin, but fresh tears kept coming. So when he missed my school plays because he had work emergencies, he was actually attending your family events. The pain in her voice was devastating. Sometimes, yes, and when he missed our family gatherings because he needed time to himself, he was here with you. He was trying to be present for everyone, but it meant he could never be fully present for anyone. Maria finally looked up, her makeup ruined by tears. I begged him for years to tell the truth. I wanted us to get married after Carmen died, wanted David and Elena to have his name, wanted to stop living in the shadows, but he always said it would hurt too many people. It would have, David said harshly, turning from the window. Do you understand what you're telling us? You're saying that our entire relationship with Raphael was built on a lie, that we were the secret family, the ones he was ashamed of. He wasn't ashamed of you, I said quickly. If you could see the letters he wrote to your mother, See the photos he kept of you, you'd know how much he loved you. He was proud of you both. Letters? Elena asked. What letters? Maria took a shaky breath. I wrote to Raphael almost every week for 34 years. He kept all my letters in his storage room behind the church in Las Cruces. That's how David found us. He read about our lives in my letters. The revelation that I'd read decades of their mother's private correspondence added another layer of violation to an already impossible situation. David's face darkened with anger. So, not only did Raphael lie to us our entire lives, but now a stranger has read our family's private business for 30 years. This keeps getting better. I'm sorry, I said. I know it's a violation of your privacy, but I had to understand who my grandfather really was. I had to know why he'd hidden you from us. Hidden us, Elena repeated bitterly, like we were something to be ashamed of. That's not how he saw it, Maria said quietly. He saw it as protecting everyone. He thought if his Las Cruces family knew about us, they'd be devastated to learn he'd been unfaithful to Carmen's memory. And he thought if you knew about them, you'd realize you were sharing him with another family and feel diminished. Well, he was right about one thing, David said. We do feel diminished. We feel like we were never good enough to be his real family. But you were his real family, I insisted. David, you're his son. Elena, you're his daughter in every way that matters. He raised you, loved you, provided for you. The fact that he couldn't acknowledge it publicly doesn't make it less true. David spun around to face me. What did you just say? I realized I'd revealed more than I'd intended. Maria was shaking her head slightly, warning me off, but it was too late. David is Raphael's biological son, I said. The letters make it clear. You were born in 1993, about 3 years after Raphael and your mother started their relationship. The color drained from David's face. That's not possible. Mom told me my father was someone she dated briefly, someone who wasn't ready for the responsibility of a child. Maria was crying again. I'm sorry, mijo. I thought it would be easier if you didn't know. Raphael couldn't acknowledge you as his son. He was married to Carmen, had a family in Las Cruces who would never understand. I thought it was kinder to let you believe your father was just someone who disappeared. Kinder? David's voice was getting louder. You thought it was kinder to let me think my father was a deadbeat who abandoned us rather than tell me he was Raphael, the man I loved more than anyone in the world. Elena was staring at David with wide eyes. Wait, if David is Raphael's biological son, then Raphael was your father this whole time, your actual father. And Elena, I said gently, even though you're not biologically his, he chose to be your father. He chose to raise you as his daughter. That's just as meaningful. But Elena was focused on the implications for David. All those times you wondered why your father didn't want you, why he wasn't part of your life. He was part of your life. He was there for almost everything, just not as your father officially. David sank into his chair, overwhelmed. I have Raphael's name, David Martinez. I always thought it was just a coincidence that Mom chose a name similar to her boyfriend's, but she named me after my actual father. Who couldn't claim you, Maria said through her tears, who loved you desperately but could never call you his son in public. The full tragedy of the situation was becoming clear. My grandfather hadn't just maintained 2 families, he denied himself the acknowledgement of his own child to protect his double life. David had grown up feeling abandoned by a father who was actually there, loving him, but unable to admit it. This is insane, Elena said, shaking her head. Our whole life has been a lie. Raphael was David's father, but we couldn't know. Raphael loved us like family, but we had to pretend he was just Mom's boyfriend. And meanwhile, in Las Cruces, another family got to claim him publicly while we lived in secret. It wasn't about choosing one family over another, I said. He loved you all. He just made an impossible choice about how to handle it. An impossible choice that hurt everyone involved, David said. Look at us, we're all damaged by this. You're finding out your grandfather wasn't who you thought he was. We're finding out our father figure was actually Eleanor's stepfather and my biological father, but we can never publicly mourn him because we don't officially exist. And Mom spent 34 years loving a man who could never fully be hers. Maria reached across the table and took David's hand. He wanted to be yours, mijo, all of ours. He just didn't know how to make it work without destroying other people he loved. Well, he's destroyed us anyway, Elena said, just differently. We sat in the wreckage of revealed truth for a long moment. Everything had changed in the space of an hour. Relationships redefined, histories rewritten, grief made more complicated by anger and confusion. Finally, David looked at me with eyes that were painfully similar to my own. So what now? What are we supposed to do with this information? Raphael is dead, so we can't confront him about it. We can't change the past 34 years, and we can't exactly introduce ourselves to your Las Cruces family as the secret relatives they never knew about. It was the question I'd been asking myself since I'd found the first letter. What was the point of revealing secrets that could only cause pain? What good could come from shattering everyone's illusions about a man who was gone? But looking at David and Eleanor, I realized there might be an answer I hadn't considered. Maybe, I said slowly, we can't change the past, but we can decide what happens next. You're my family, my uncle and my aunt, even if we've never met before. David, your children are my cousins. We're connected by blood and by the man who loved us all, even if he couldn't love us all publicly. What are you suggesting? Eleanor asked. I'm suggesting that maybe Raphael's greatest wish was that someday his two families would know each other. Maybe that's why he kept all those letters, why he left clues for me to find. Maybe he hoped that after he was gone, we could finish what he never had the courage to start. Maria looked up with something that might have been hope. You want our families to know each other. I want us to be what we actually are, family. It won't change what happened, won't make the secrets any less painful. But maybe we can honor Raphael's memory by being honest about who we all are to each other. David was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. Your cousins in Las Cruces, are they going to be able to handle learning that their saintly grandfather had a secret family for 34 years? I don't know, I admitted. It's going to be hard for them to hear, but they deserve to know the truth, and you deserve to be acknowledged as family. And your grandfather's estate? Elena asked quietly. Legally? Do we have any claim to his property? I'd been wondering about that myself. I don't know. David is his son, so he probably has legal rights. But more importantly, you all have moral rights. Raphael should have provided for you in his will, should have acknowledged you as his family. He did provide for us, Maria said. He helped with college expenses, house payments, everything we needed over the years. He just did it quietly, without documentation. But now that he's gone, that support is gone too, I pointed out. And you have no legal standing to claim anything, no recognition as his family. David stood up again and walked to the mantelpiece where family photos were arranged. He picked up one that showed him Elena and Raphael at what looked like a graduation ceremony. You know what the craziest part is? He said. Looking at this picture now, I can see it. I can see that he's my father. The way he's standing next to me, the pride in his eyes, the way his hand is on my shoulder. It's not the way a family friend stands with someone else's kid. It's the way a father stands with his son. Elena joined him at the mantelpiece. And here's one from my wedding. Look at his face when he's walking me down the aisle. That's not family-friend emotion, that's father emotion. All the evidence was there, Maria said. We all just agreed not to see it, because acknowledging it would have meant acknowledging how complicated and painful the situation really was. I joined them at the mantelpiece, looking at 30 years of family photos that told the story of a love that existed in the margins of possibility. Raphael had been there for all the important moments, but always as something less than what he really was to them. So, I said, do you want to meet the rest of your family? David and Elena looked at each other, having one of those silent conversations that siblings share. Finally, Elena nodded. Yes, she said, but not because we want anything from your grandfather's estate, and not because we're trying to claim something that wasn't ours. We want to meet them because we're tired of being a secret. We want to be acknowledged as the family we've always been. And, David added, because maybe it's time for Raphael's children and grandchildren to know each other, even if he never got to see it happen. As the evening sun set over Albuquerque, we began planning how to bridge the gap between my grandfather's two worlds. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't undo 34 years of secrecy and separation. But for the first time since I'd found those letters, I felt like we were moving towards something positive, rather than just unraveling something painful. The truth had been devastating, but it had also been liberating. Now we could finally grieve Rafael Martinez honestly, not as the perfect man we'd thought he was, but as the flawed, loving, impossibly complicated human being he'd actually been. And maybe, in the end, that was a better foundation for a family than the secrets he'd tried so hard to protect. 3 weeks later, I stood in my grandfather's backyard in Las Cruces, watching my cousin Patricia set up folding chairs under the old cottonwood tree where we'd played as children. It was a warm Saturday afternoon in late October, and the autumn light filtering through the leaves created patterns on the ground that reminded me of every family gathering we'd ever had in this same spot. But today would be different from all the others. "Are you sure about this?" Patricia asked for the 5th time that morning. "Once we do this, we can't undo it. Everyone's going to know about Abuelo's situation." My 3 cousins had not taken the news well when I'd called them from Albuquerque 3 weeks earlier. Patricia had cried. Miguel had gotten angry. Carmen had gone silent for so long, I thought she'd hung up. But eventually, after I'd explained everything I'd learned and shown them some of the letters, they'd agreed that David and Elena deserved to be acknowledged as family. "They're our family," I said, adjusting one of the chairs. "They always were. We just didn't know it." Miguel walked out of the house carrying a cooler full of drinks. At 35, he was the oldest of us cousins and had always been the most protective of our grandfather's memory. "I still can't believe Abuelo did this to us. To Abuela Carmen. He didn't do it to hurt anyone," I said. "He was trying to love everyone without destroying anyone. It was impossible, but he tried." Carmen emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of food, her 8-year-old daughter, Sophia, trailing behind her. "Sophia keeps asking why we're having a family party without Abuelo," she said quietly. "I don't know what to tell her." "Tell her we're meeting some family members Abuelo loved very much," Patricia suggested. "That's true." A car pulled into the driveway, and my heart started beating faster. Through the front window, I could see Maria in the passenger seat, David driving, and Elena in the back with 2 small children, David's kids, my grandfather's grandchildren, who shared his name and his eyes. "They're here!" I called out. My cousins gathered around me as we walked to the front of the house. I could see the nervousness on all their faces, the same uncertainty I'd felt 3 weeks ago when I'd knocked on Maria's door in Albuquerque. David parked behind my car and got out slowly, his eyes taking in the modest adobe house where his father had lived another life for 60 years. Eleanor emerged from the back seat, helping her 4-year-old nephew out of his car seat while keeping hold of his 6-year-old sister. Maria was the last to get out, and I could see her hands shaking as she smoothed her dress. This was the first time she'd ever been to Las Cruces, the first time she'd seen the house where Rafael had lived, as our grandfather, instead of their father figure. "Welcome," I said, walking toward them. "Thank you for coming." David nodded, still looking around at the neighborhood, the church in the distance, the landscape that had been part of his father's secret life. "It's smaller than I imagined," he said quietly. "The house, the whole thing, Las Cruces, the neighborhood, this life he had here. I always pictured it as something grand, something so important, it was worth keeping us secret for." Eleanor was holding her nephew's hand, and I could see her studying my cousins' faces, probably looking for family resemblances just as I'd done with her and David. "These are my cousins," I said, making introductions that should have happened 30 years ago. "Patricia, Miguel, Carmen, and Carmen's daughter Sophia. And these are David's children," Elena said, gently pushing the kids forward. "Diego is 6 and Anna is 4. The children looked curious, but not particularly concerned about the significance of the meeting. To them, this was just another adult gathering to endure. But Sophia, who was closer to their age, immediately gravitated toward them. "Do you want to see the backyard?" she asked Diego. "There's a really good climbing tree." As the children ran off together, the adults stood in an awkward circle, decades of separation and secrecy creating an invisible barrier between us. Patricia was the first to break the ice. "You have Abuelo's eyes," she said to David. "All of you do." "People always said that," David replied, "but we never knew why the resemblance was so strong." Miguel was studying Maria with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You knew our grandmother was still alive when you started your relationship with our grandfather." It was a blunt question, but not an unfair one. Maria nodded, meeting his gaze directly. "Yes, I knew. It doesn't excuse what we did, but I want you to understand. I never intended to fall in love with a married man. It just happened, and by the time we realized how serious it was, we were in too deep to walk away easily." 34 years is a long time to be in too deep," Carmen said quietly. "Yes, it is," Maria agreed, "and I'm not proud of how it began. But I am proud of the family we built together, and I'm grateful for the father Rafael was to my children, even if he couldn't acknowledge them publicly." Elena stepped forward. "We're not here to defend what happened or to ask for your forgiveness. We're here because David found out about us and thought we should know each other. If you'd rather we left—" "No," Patricia said quickly. "Don't leave. This is it's a lot to process. Our grandfather was the most important person in our lives, and learning that he had another family changes everything we thought we knew about him." It changes things for us too, David said, learning that we had cousins we never knew about, that Raphael had another family he loved just as much as he loved us. We always wondered why he seemed sad sometimes, why he couldn't give us all of himself. Now we know. We moved to the backyard, where the folding chairs were arranged in a rough circle under the cottonwood tree. The children had indeed found the old tire swing and were taking turns pushing each other, their laughter filling the afternoon air. This is where we had all our family gatherings, I explained to Maria, David, and Eleanor. Christmas mornings, birthday parties, Sunday dinners. Abuelo would sit in that chair right there. I pointed to an old wooden chair that had been his favorite. He'd watch all us kids play and tell stories about when he was young in Mexico. He told us those same stories, Elena said with a sad smile, about crossing the border, about his first job in construction, about how different America was from what he'd expected. Carmen sat down heavily in one of the folding chairs. So he was sharing everything. His stories, his love, his time between two families. No wonder he always looked tired. The letters Mom wrote, David said, settling into a chair next to her. They talk about how hard it was on him, trying to be everything to everyone. She kept asking him to choose, to make the relationship public, but he always said he couldn't bear to hurt either family. So he hurt both families instead, Miguel said, but his voice wasn't angry anymore, just sad. Maria nodded. That's exactly what happened. We all got pieces of him, but none of us got all of him, and he carried the guilt of that for 34 years. Tell us about him in Albuquerque, Patricia said suddenly. What was he like when he was with your family? Elena and David looked at each other. Then Elena smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since we'd met. He was playful there, she said, more relaxed than you might think. He taught David how to throw a curveball in our backyard, helped me with my algebra homework at the kitchen table. He was always fixing things around Mom's house, painting rooms, building shelves. He said keeping busy with his hands helped him think. He did the same things here, Patricia said with wonder. He was always working on some project, always helping one of us with something. I thought it was just his way of showing love. It was, David said. But maybe he also stayed busy because it was easier than thinking about the impossible situation he'd created. Sophia ran over to us, breathless from playing. Mama, can Diego and Ana come to my school with me sometime? They're really fun. The innocent question highlighted what everyone was thinking. These children were cousins who might have grown up together if their grandfather hadn't felt the need to keep his two families separate. We'll see, mija, Carmen said gently. As the afternoon wore on, we shared stories about our grandfather, and slowly a more complete picture of Rafael Martinez emerged. In Las Cruces, he'd been the devoted family man, the pillar of the church, the man who never quite got over losing his wife. In Albuquerque, he'd been the loving partner, the devoted father figure, the man who was building a new life but couldn't fully commit to it. Both versions were true, but neither was complete. There's something I need to show you all, I said finally, getting up to retrieve a folder I'd brought from the house. I found this in Abuelo's desk after I read all the letters. Inside the folder was a document I'd discovered during my final sweep of his belongings, a will that had never been filed, dated just 6 months before his death. In it, he'd attempted to provide for both families, splitting his modest estate between his Las Cruces grandchildren and his Albuquerque children. He'd also included a letter explaining his double life and asking for forgiveness from everyone involved. He knew he was running out of time, I said, as everyone read through the documents. He was trying to find a way to make things right, but he died before he could figure out how to reveal the truth. Maria was crying again as she read his letter to her. He says he always planned to marry me after his health got worse, when he couldn't maintain the pretense anymore. He wanted to legitimize our family before he died. And he wanted to tell us about you, Patricia said, reading over her shoulder. He says here that he hoped his Las Cruces family would welcome his Albuquerque family with love instead of judgment. David was looking at the will with wonder. He left me part of his estate. He acknowledged me as his son in legal documents, even if he never did it in life. Which means, I said, that you have a legal right to inherit from him. You're not just his emotional son, you're his legal son too. What about the house? Eleanor asked. Are you selling it? We were going to, Miguel said, but maybe we shouldn't be so quick to get rid of the place where our families are finally meeting each other. Over the next hour, we worked out the practical details of our newly expanded family. David would inherit his legal share of our grandfather's estate, which meant the house sale would be postponed while we figured out what everyone wanted. More importantly, we exchanged phone numbers, made plans for future visits, and began the process of becoming the family we'd always been but never known we were. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the backyard, the children had worn themselves out playing and were sprawled on a blanket, sharing snacks. Diego and Anna were chattering with Sofia as if they'd known each other their whole lives. "Look at them," Elena said, watching her nephew show Sofia how to make a paper airplane. "They're already family. No complications, no secrets, just family." "Maybe that's the lesson," I said. "Maybe the next generation doesn't have to carry the weight of the previous generation's choices." Maria stood up, smoothing her dress and looking around the backyard one more time. "Raphael would have loved this," she said quietly, seeing all his children and grandchildren together in one place, finally knowing each other. It's what he dreamed about, but never thought was possible. "It is possible," David said, getting up to help gather the children's toys. "It just took him dying for us to have the courage to make it happen." As we prepared to say goodbye, Patricia approached Maria with something in her hands, a photo album I recognized from our grandfather's living room. "These are pictures of Raphael with our family over the years," she said. "I thought you might like copies of some of them, and maybe you could share some pictures of him with your family, so we can all see the whole story?" Maria accepted the album with tears in her eyes. "I'd like that very much." David shook hands with each of my cousins, but when he got to me, he pulled me into a hug instead. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for reading those letters, for finding us, for having the courage to tell the truth. I finally got to meet my father's other family. I finally got to be acknowledged as his son. That's worth everything." As they drove away, I stood with my cousins watching the taillights disappear into the New Mexico evening. The backyard felt different now, bigger somehow, like it had expanded to accommodate a larger definition of family. "So what now?" Carmen asked. "Now we figure out how to be a family that includes everyone," I said. "We invite them to Christmas. They invite us to birthday parties. We let the kids grow up knowing their cousins. We honor Abuelo's memory by being honest about who he was and who we all are to each other." "Even if it's complicated?" Miguel asked. "Especially because it's complicated," Patricia said. "The easy relationships don't teach you anything. The hard ones, the ones that require forgiveness and understanding and growth, those are the ones that make you who you're supposed to be." 6 months later, I got a text message with a photo attached. It was from Elena, showing Diego and Anna playing in their backyard in Albuquerque with Sofia, who was visiting for spring break. All 3 children were laughing, covered in dirt, completely unconscious of the decades of secrecy that had kept their families apart. Below the photo, Elena had written, "Abuelo would be proud." She was right. Our grandfather had spent 34 years trying to love 2 families without letting them know about each other. He died thinking his secret would die with him, that his 2 worlds would never meet. Instead, his death had become the bridge between those worlds. The letters he'd saved, the storage room he'd maintained, the will he'd written but never filed, they'd all been breadcrumbs leading us toward each other. Rafael Martinez had been a flawed man who'd made an impossible choice and spent his life paying for it. But he'd also been a man who'd loved deeply, completely, and without reservation. In the end, that love had been stronger than the secrets that tried to contain it. We'd found each other not despite his secrets, but because of them. And now his grandchildren were growing up together, free to love each other openly and without complications, in a way he'd never been able to love any of us. Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free immediately. Sometimes it takes time, patience, and the courage to build something new from the pieces of something broken. But when it finally does set you free, when the secrets finally give way to honest love, it's worth the wait. Behind that church in Las Cruces, my grandfather had kept the story of 2 families who never knew they were one. Now, thanks to the letters he couldn't bring himself to destroy, those families were finally complete.